All right. Hello, everyone. Um, so today, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, um, and you know, something that I'll just bring this up. As many of you know, right? I'm qualifying myself here. As many of you know, I Mark Buber has been perhaps the biggest and life changing thinker for myself as an individual. Hello, Sam. Um, but sometimes it gets hard to ignore um, some of the problems that Buber kind of foresaw. Um, and some of the things that is difficult to express what Buber means is that as much as uh, as much as we want this discourse to see human beings as human beings, we have this sort of obscuring imposition to see human beings as human beings. Um, and what is so difficult about philosophy and what is so difficult about relating it to people is that as much as I am for the idea that philosophy requires work, philosophy requires people to suffer through thinking, to suffer through reading difficult work, and so on. Uh, I will say that there is a huge lack of relation to people with people in society um, concerning philosophy and human relations. For me, what's really troubling is that there's all these great ideas. People have all these great ideas. I think Zizek has great ideas. I think Badu has great ideas. Lacan has great ideas. All these people have great ideas. Okay. The problem is the discourse stops within the range of people that engage with these thinkers. They never quite go outside those circles. Um, and so I like Buber a lot because it seems like not only the task of philosophy is to do the thinking and the work and everything, but it seems to be like there's a fundamental lack in relating to people about why these concepts can be important or should be thought about. Um, Not only did I see this with COVID too, right? Like it's the fact that there is so much suspicion about authority now, and I don't think it's merely because of their suspicion and because there's like information. Yes, there's information about the world, but I think the suspicion itself is because there's a lack of, in general, a lack of trust in there. There's just a lack of trust in everything now, and part of actual relations is trust. For Buber, is mutual trust, and that is actually related to faith. Like that is Buber's definition of faith. It's actually trust. It's not like faith in a certain being or God, but it's a faith in this presence as a human being, right? So I will read. I have the 100th the 100th anniversary issue of I Thou, which I was really excited to because it has Paul-Mendes-Flohr's introduction or forward, I believe. Yeah, introduction, and it's amazing. It's amazing because I think Paul-Mendes-Flohr is probably one of the greatest contemporary like Buber scholars that we have today. And considering like how much I've read Buber, and then like reading Paul-Mendes-Flohr's understanding, I can tell like my understanding matches very quite well with his. So it's comforting, and then also like nice to like reaffirm like, okay, um, I think I have grasped some of the concepts that Buber has portrayed. But anyways, I wanted to read this specific passage that Paul-Mendes-Flohr gives, and he says it here. He says, in I and thou relation, one responds to the presence of the other spontaneously, innocently, without forethought, but also without habit. One does not experience the human being to whom one says thou as an it, as an object of goal-directed verbs. Rather, one stands in relation to him in the sacred basic word I thou. One holds or positions oneself in the sacred I thou relation without any intention other than being utterly present, attentive to the presence of the other. The dialogical relation is born neither of a purposeful cognitive nor ethical intent. What then, Buber asks, does one learn of the other when one relates to him or her in the sacred stance of the I thou relation? Nothing at all. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because that's probably the biggest lump. Like that's the biggest like obstacle in understanding Buber, is that this being present, this being attentive, is not an act of cognition. It's not an act of cognition. You don't come out knowing anything. And how I've learned to explain this is the fact that there is this Spanish difference in called saber and conocer. Saber in Spanish is to know like a fact or like something specifically, and then there's conocer, which is the idea of recognition, understanding, like, well, not understanding, but recognition, knowing someone. But in English, we use knowing interchangeably between like I know evolution and I know this person, right? But if we take the Spanish distinction between conocer and saber, that's what Buber is fundamentally making a distinction with. There's two types of knowing, and fundamentally the relation that Buber wants us to pay attention to is the conocer, is the recognition, the being present, that there is somebody there before us, standing before us, and merely being present. And so it's not a matter of necessarily knowing facts about this person. It's about understanding that you are meeting something, that something is present before you as an individual, as a being, whether it be art, nature, spirit, etc., etc. Buber goes all into these details in the I and Thou. And it is, I think, something that's fundamentally missing sometimes. And it can get obscured by a lot of things. The last thing I will address is that I think Buber disagreed a lot with Levinas in terms of certain things, because Levinas made it a sort of ethical imposition. But the problem with making it an ethical imposition is that you almost get rid of the spontaneousness of actually relating to somebody. The spontaneity, that's what I meant. The spontaneity of relating to somebody. Because I think the danger with making an ethical imposition is that it becomes a sort of normative thing to do. And then once we start doing that, it becomes like a sort of ethical, social way of conducting ourselves that fundamentally then becomes just like, we're just acting now. Like, that's the hard part, is like us as human beings, we start acting these social norms, these social cues, and it starts to obscure real relations with people. And that's one of the dangers, and that's why it cannot be a fundamental ethical imposition the entire time. And I think it's a little bit dangerous to be like, it's our responsibility. It's like, yes, it's our responsibility, but if you make it like a sort of imposition, people start acting out the imposition, and then it's no longer a real relation. And so like that really is the fundamental problem with some of these like um ideas even in our society right now about like wanting to relate to people, understand people, and then we make it like a kind of ethical command, but um that can ironically, even though it's well-meaning, it can really deter and obscure some real relational encounters with people. But yeah, I think I'll finish maybe the last section of it, of this passage. It says, in the I and thou relation, one beholds the numinous presence of the other. It does not help to sustain you in life. It only helps you to glimpse eternity. Or as Buber would later explain, the I-thou relation to God and the I-thou relation to one's fellow man are at bottom related to each other. Thus, Buber prefaced as the motto of the Ich und Du, words of Goethe, so I've wrested from you in the end God's presence in each element. So it's this idea that we can glimpse eternity by having a possibility of a genuine relation. But I will stop there. I think, I don't know, I've been debating like whether I want to ritualistically read I and Thou every year. Just because like every single time I do it, I always gain something new. And the fact that this is a kind of renewed translation makes me want to read it again, because I think I had actually my very first I and Thou book was from the Smith translation, which was actually the very first translation that ever came out. So I'm like very honored that I had that translation. But I think most people have the Kaufman translation, which is like the second one. But I think the first time I read it, I like had an experience. Like I definitely had an experience. And it was funny because it was such an experience that I couldn't intellectually understand what exactly I took out of it. Like, I don't think I actually took anything out of my first reading of I and Thou, because it was just like this. I felt like I genuinely was encountering a kind of presence in reading Martin Buber, which is why I think it so viscerally affected me as a reader, and I can never stop talking about him. But yeah, I think Martin Buber is one of those thinkers that he deserves a lot of he deserves a little bit more attention, actually, I think. But it's a little bit unfortunate that he kind of came around the time of like Heidegger and like all these other great thinkers. That's like, yeah, I mean, I would say Heidegger probably took that era a little bit, and so did some other thinkers. And I think it's unfortunate that Martin Buber is kind of guarded as like a Jewish like thinker to to dance with, basically, and he's not really too much in the conversation of philosophy, it feels like, which I can kind of see, because I mean there's not really much in terms of like epistemology or anything, but I think when it comes to like human relations, how do we really have genuine human relations, and those kind of epistemological questions and maybe even ontological questions, it does, I think Buber shines very well in this kind of area of thought, which I think when it comes to like relating other philosophical ideas, I feel like you kind of need Buber first, because I feel like without any real relations, any real possibility of glimpsing, it makes ideas hard to want to relate. It seems just not capable of relating. and we don't have trust, and we don't have mutuality, and all these other things. Okay, I'm gonna read some. Looks like got Sam and Pay in the chat here. Sam, you're like, this is so great. I'm gonna get emotional when Buber makes me makes my way too emotional. You said makes you think of the impromptu Christmas party my close friends and I had yesterday. No pictures, no real planning, just get lost in the genuine communication. This is not a great way to explain. This I know, but there are no words. Yeah, I mean, I think it's yeah, it's definitely like you don't really come out knowing more per se, but it is, you could say, kind of more like genuine, just like presence, being there. Maybe if we were to use like a Heidegger kind of notion of just like, it's just this idea of like being there, but like in a authentic, genuine way. This idea of being there, as being, and so because I know Martin Buber and Heidegger are similar in some aspects when they talk about language, and I know that they had a friendship with each other to some degree. I also know that they disagreed fundamentally on religious issues. And Buber apparently openly admitted that he that he liked Heidegger as a person more than his written works, which I guess kind of says a lot about Buber, right? Like he liked the person and not the products of one's work. So I think that really says something. And then of course these accusations about, well, maybe not accusations, I don't really know. But this idea that, like Heidegger was like kind of like fascist, Nazi, everything else. And Martin Buber's a Jew, right? And he's has this friendship with Heidegger. So that I find extremely fascinating, right? And almost a kind of like you said, Sam, like, yeah, he seems to practice what he preaches, right? I think I have also read some biographical accounts of like people meeting Buber and being like, yeah, he was in person. He felt like a force, like a real attentive force as a human being, which is really inspiring, actually. I would have loved to have met him, um, and I think obviously it roots back to like a more further regret I think Buber had in his when he was younger, about like the soldier that killed himself. Soldier was asking him all these questions, kind of woke him up in the, I think, middle of the night to ask him these questions, and Buber answered all of his questions, and then literally the next day the soldier kills himself. And that was how Buber started rethinking, like, okay, is there something that was missing in that interaction? Because I felt like I answered everything that the soldier was asking, and it does put into perspective that even though people are asking and saying things, that doesn't necessarily, your answering does not mean that you are being present and being attentive. um, and I think obviously what Buber is asking for is very hard, but because it has to be spontaneous, right? Like it's not something you can just actively do. But I think what Buber is teaching us is that it's about this sort of positioning yourself to be able to experience that, to be able to have that encounter. It's not necessarily guaranteed. It's not necessarily that you'll be successful, but it's this idea of positioning yourself to encounter the possibility of a genuine interaction with people. You said, are you going to read it or experience it over and over again? Well, I don't know. I mean, I think like I don't think anything is going to compare to my first experience with reading I and Thou, but I think I think intellectually I get more and more out of it um, than I did the last. I would say. Let's see. Okay. You said that is really fascinating. It seems that in the genuine meaning, the differences fall away in our momentary forgotten. Yeah, this idea of like encountering eternity is, or glimpsing eternity is very fascinating to me. Um, Buber also talked about like how he like there's this story about like when you look at it like a cat's eyes or like an animal's eyes, like there's also like that kind of thing. And I've had those brief moments too where I'm like looking at my cat and like there's also this time where he's like staring like directly at me, and then you're like, these eyes almost seem way more than animal, right? Like way more than animal. And I think that is what is there with that. Um, but yeah. Anyways, thank you guys for listening and being here. And yeah, all right. Take care. Bye.